Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Altitude. It's our brand new live stream series. My name's Ady Dolan, and I'm an air traffic controller working at NATS at Heathrow. I've been a controller there for the past 20 years, and I am still loving every minute of it. I'm a little bit biased, but I do think it's the best job in the world. With Altitude, we hope to give you a behind-the-scenes look at ATC and how it works, and of course, the people who make it all possible. A reminder that there will be time at the end for you to ask questions on our Q&A. So if there's anything you want to ask us, please pop it into the text box that you can hopefully see on your screen. We're going to try our absolute best to avoid too many acronyms, but I'm afraid that we do simply love them. So please excuse us if we manage to slip a few in. And for our very first episode, I am absolutely delighted to have virtually with me today, Rob Mitchell, who is an oceanic controller at NATS Prestwick Centre in Scotland. Hello, Rob.
Hi, Ady. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. We'll be talking to Rob about what it's like to manage the world's busiest oceanic airspace and how that works and the changes that have been made possible since 2019 with the introduction of real-time satellite-based tracking, something that was a world first and has made a huge difference to Rob and the team in Scotland. We're also delighted to have a very, very special guest with us from across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C. It's Aireon's Chief Technology Officer, Vinny Capezzuto. Good morning, Vinny. How are you?
Good morning. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Vinny, let's start with you. We're going to talk about Aireon and how you guys work. But first of all, a little bit about yourself and your own background in aviation and how you came to work at Aireon.
Absolutely. So let's see, it was 15 years in the private sector, working on navigation aids, radars for the FAA. And then eventually I joined the FAA for 18 years. And then I joined Aireon 6 years ago. And, it's just been a great ride and a great place to be.
Okay, and we got to this thing that we call ADSB. So for layman's terms and for tower controllers, what is ADSB?
It stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. And essentially, if you compare it to how you get surveillance with radar calculates the position of the aircraft, range, bearing, altitude. The altitude's derived by interrogating the aircraft and receiving the barometric pressure from the actual aircraft. And so that's done from the radar. And now with ADSB and the advent of GNSS or GPS, right? Everyone knows global positioning. So the aircraft knows where it's at, and it actually broadcasts its position twice a second. And so we're just listening to it and able to compile the information and provide it to the automation systems that the air traffic controllers use for providing their services to the pilots.
Okay, great. And before this fantastic technology, what kind of things were you involved with prior to the Aireon days?
Well, I was involved with many of the different radars, from the primary radars, which basically just get reflections off the aircraft, and it doesn't work absolutely great, but it's great when the transponder component of it doesn't work. So the transponder is a device on the aircraft that you interrogate, and it gets the reply from, and the radar uses that to kind of identify the aircraft. So I've worked on those types of radars. They're called primary and secondary radar. You'll see them at the airports spinning around. And then I actually worked in the research and development on ADSB at the end of the 90s and watched that get into fruition for the ground surface surveillance first, and then eventually it worked its way into the en route environment. And with Aireon, we were able to expand it to the oceanic environment where you cannot deploy ground infrastructure like ground stations that do ADSB, or another technology called multilateration where they triangulate positions of the transponder output.
Excellent. So, Rob, what was it like trying to manage this enormous piece of airspace like the North Atlantic without real-time flight tracking? How on earth did that work?
It was straightforward enough in its simplicity because we didn't have a lot of the stuff that you're used to having on the land. And obviously, Ady, you and I do a very different type of controlling. My background, I've been with NATS now for 14 years, and having finished at the NATS College of Air Traffic Control, got posted up to lovely sunny Scotland, and I've been working on the ocean ever since. And it was a very strange environment to join, because all of my colleagues who I went to college with, who went on to do area control, the rest of them went into a radar environment. So they were used to working with the radars that Vinny's mentioned, used to having VHF radio, which you'll be used to. And I went to the ocean, where we use, at that point, predominantly HF radio to communicate with aircraft, which is a horrible, horrible thing to have to listen to. I'm pleased to say that thankfully we don't do the talking on that ourselves. We have our colleagues in Ireland who take care of that part for us. When I joined, we did have some technologies that we were using, some satellite technologies. We had positioning by ADSC, which is Automatic Dependent Surveillance Contract, which is where essentially we tell the aircraft, we want you to give us a report at a particular time, and then we hopefully receive that report from the aircraft. And we could also communicate with aircraft, not just through the HF radio, but also using CPDLC, which is Controller Pilot Data Link Communications. But it was very much a strange environment, because we were aware of the fact that whilst we had a computer system to support us in what we were doing, which gave us our electronic flight progress strips, it gave us some of the workload that we had to do, had a map on it, which had some aircraft symbol on it, but essentially that's all it was. It was a plot of where we thought the aircraft were.
How big is this map, Rob?
So it covers essentially, when we look at the map, we look at the whole of the Atlantic, or we can zoom in on smaller parts of that. But certainly in the ocean environment, we're interested in clearing aircraft in from oceanic entry to landfall. So we're looking at the east coast of the US, and we plan aircraft to be in safe. We give them a cleared flight level, a cleared route, a cleared MAC number, and we use that information in combination with a MET model that we have within the system to plot where we think aircraft will be. And essentially at that point, we're looking for those aircraft to tell us, as they go across the ocean, are they where we expect them to be? There's an element of trust there, I would say, without surveillance. If an aircraft says it's at 56 north, 20 west, I have to trust that it is. And if it says that it's going to go to an incorrect position at 30 west, then I also have to trust that that's the case and react accordingly. So we were doing things blind, essentially. You trust that once you've received that position report, aircraft are still where you want them to be. But it's not the kind of thing that certainly a domestic radar controller would be used to, because quite simply, they can see the aircraft.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a weird thing that we start our ATC careers on day one on exactly the same path. And then you get split into all these different strands. And what the public might think of as being an air traffic controller, it could be the person in the tower, the person on the radar screen, or usually the person at the airport with the ping pong bats. But here we are, we're two air traffic controllers, but we effectively do two very, very different tasks, but some similar skill sets and some, I guess, completely different.
Absolutely, I would agree. And I think that something that you struck upon there is the public perception of what we do and how we do it. And I think that something that would probably terrify people actually getting on planes is the idea that up until March last year, when they flew across the Atlantic, we couldn't see them. ADSB gives us that capability now, and it's a very, very strange thing to think that before that we had those reports coming through. We potentially had what ADSC provided us, but what ADSB gives us now is essentially the similar sort of picture to what a domestic controller would have with that radar capability.
Excellent. So let's get into that then and talk about the development and how we got to the point of going live in March last year and what that was like. I'm guessing it's not just a case of getting switching on a system and off you go. So Vinny, talk us through the development of the Aireon solution. There's got to be some great stories there of the highs and lows and the moment of actually going live. Where did you start and how did it all go?
Well, the design component of it actually started probably around 2011. where they and I wasn't even with the company at the time, right? So I walked in, and the design was established, but the manufacturing was full speed ahead. And like you stated, you could imagine this is a large scale project. And it's not just about, they had to make a decision concerning a payload. So the Iridium company, right, has communication satellites that were deployed at the end of the 90s. And around 2008, they started, reviewing the life cycle of that infrastructure and determining, well, I think we need to start designing the next generation. And in doing that, they decided, well, we can also host a payload that does another function than the communication functions that Iridium provides, the SATCOM, SATCOM kind of capability. And so they went through an alternatives analysis trade study and determined that ADSB would be the ideal service to provide. And so to kind of put it into perspective, there's 66 active satellites, in polar orbit around the Earth. It's at low Earth orbit, like 780 kilometers above the Earth. And so literally a satellite will be over a space on the Earth, and 100 minutes later it will be back over that space again. Okay. And the Earth would have rotated underneath this. So it's a mesh network of satellites that are constantly moving, and they communicate forward and aft and to the side with each satellite. And then, so in determining the ADSB payload, that kind of brought in another manufacturing stream. So Harris was the manufacturer of the payload, which is really the heart of the system, because you have to be able to receive these signals coming off the aircraft in space, and then you got to use the Iridium mesh network to ground it in these teleport networks that are in specific locations on the Earth, in Iqaluit, and Fairbanks, Alaska, and Punta Arena. So they're in Svalbard, Norway, instead of Iqaluit, Svalbard, Norway. So these are 3 locations that they ground the information, and then we bring it over to the service delivery point where the air traffic controller uses it. Do that in less than half a second from the time we receive it to the time we deliver it to the automation system the controllers are using. Yeah, wow. That's important.
That's seriously important. And everything about this project seems to be absolutely massive. The scale is huge. So you've got big jets flying over oceans and satellites in space. And I mean, how on earth do you deal with space as part of your project? I mean, we all spent a bit of time this summer stuck in our gardens looking at SpaceX satellites whizzing past at night. What's it like having the pressure of space flight attached to your project?
Yeah, so from a program manager perspective, that was probably the biggest challenge, and Iridium managed that component, but SpaceX was the delivery mechanism. They were the company that delivered every one of the satellites. And as you could imagine, you're scheduling these launches that don't necessarily always happen on time. You probably saw the launch on Sunday evening. That was really exciting. The movement there, the things that go on. I've been to 4 of the 8 launches. It's a very exciting place to be. I mean, literally, you're a couple of miles away from the rocket, and you get to view it, and then you get to hear it. The sound wave rushes over you. It's a pretty exciting experience. But it is the wild card somewhat, and it took 2 years of launching. So we finished in January 2019. So January 2017 were the beginning of the first launches, and we were putting 10 satellites up with 10 payloads on for each launch. And then Iridium had to do a fancy the job of moving the satellites around in space, right? Because they had infrastructure there. They had to run dual operations. They had to keep their current customers happy while bringing in this new satellite infrastructure and then transitioning out the old one. So it's an orchestration of actually moving their spaceships, right? There's fuel on board. They're moving them around, and then they had to pull all the old ones out of space. The other component of it was, just as you mentioned, like, what does it feel like? Well, when we finally had all 66 with 9 spares in space, right? We had to complete our testing, and that testing, if you could imagine, was January. And as Rob went live with this in March, end of March. So we had a bunch of testing we did up to that point, but we had to finalize our testing, finalize our safety case, finalize all the components that we were handing to NATS and NAV Canada so that they could go through their finalization. And you could imagine they had to get all the controllers trained up and ready to go, because they went live like March 27th. So it was a strong run up to accomplishing what we call an initial operational capability.
Wow.
Quite interesting from our side as well, Ady. As Vinny's probably alluded to there already, essentially these guys have got this epic project going on their side, doing something that's never been done before. It's huge. And on the back end of that, ourselves and Nav Canada have decided, to tell you what, let's use it straight away. Let's do something really quite special. So we were doing a usual NATS project for ourselves, a big NATS project. I've been involved with project with NATS now for about 7 years. And for me, ADSB was the big one. That was the one that I really wanted to get involved in. And that's what really everything kind of led up to.
Yeah.
We've had a number of projects on the NATS where we've used technologies to allow us to essentially put aircraft closer together and have improvements in safety as we go along. But ADSB was the jewel in the crown, without a doubt. And so whilst we were trying to do all of our planning work, and as Vinny said, we're trying to train our controllers, we're trying to produce our procedures, we were engaging with the regulator, it was difficult not to be distracted by what was going on with these guys and looking and saying, is the latest satellite launch gone okay? Is it this weekend? Is it doing this time, that time? Every time we saw delays as a result of weather or anything else that was happening, we thought, are the guys going to manage to bring this back? What kind of effect is this going to have on us? But obviously, they planned for these eventualities, and it all came good in the end. But yeah, it was difficult at times to do what we needed to do and not be distracted by the huge amount of work that had to be done by everybody to make this a success.
Yeah. So Rob, were you there on the day of the going live on the first flight?
I was in the ops room. I was controlling aircraft as essentially we switched from our old version of the software that didn't support the ADSB signal coming in to the new version that brought all of that data in.
Wow. And what did that feel like? Do you remember the call sign of the flight, or is...
No.
You're not as sad as I am.
I have to be honest, it was a bit of a non-event, actually.
Oh, that's what you want.
It's potentially not what you're expecting to hear, but it really was for us, because what we were trying to do was use the ADSB reports and take the benefit from those to allow us to put ASEPs in. But what we didn't want to do was fundamentally change what our controllers have to do, how they have to work, and the HMI that they have to work with in the system. So essentially, we'd spent a long time working towards getting our current system to a place that it could support ADSB, such that essentially when we switched it on, we had a little bit more information on the screen than we were used to. The same small orange aircraft symbols were there, but it had a bit more information next to them. I think the really key thing for us, though, was the realization that actually we're no longer in a position where we're guessing that's where the aircraft is, where we're relying on the system plotting it, but it might not really be there. I'm now looking at a surveillance picture, and that realization, I think, for all of the controllers, that was a pretty magical moment.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about all that hard work that goes on behind the scenes, and it reminds me of when the first passengers flew on Concorde and they were flying at Mach 2, and they said, well, where's all the bumps and the bells and the whistles? And they said, well, yeah, that was the difficult part of the design. So it pays off when you put the work in early doors. So what are you now getting, Rob, in terms of the benefits for us and for the airlines? And what personal difference has it made to the team, to the controllers?
I think the easiest benefit for customers is the fact that ADSB enables primarily ASEPs separation standards. So we would previously have, I think the lowest separation standard that we would have would equate to about 40 miles between aircraft. ASEPs allows us to go down to 14 nautical miles between aircraft. So it's a huge improvement. And what that does is it really improves the flexibility that we have with the airspace. It is a massive patch of airspace that we're controlling, but as a result of the weather, we can't use all of it at the same time. You know, aircraft all want to be in the same place at the same time. That's just how it works. What this enables us to do, though, is give better clearances to those aircraft and give more customers what it is that they're after. So there's a really clear, defined service benefit there. But I think the other thing, we haven't really touched on, but safety. for everybody. It was a huge safety benefit. It's not something that we really want to give a lot of thought to, but obviously there have been, in recent memory, instances of aircraft in ocean environments that have been lost. And it's taken a long time for us to be able to track those aircraft, find out what happened to them, and get the black boxes from those aircraft. We're now in a position for all ADSB aircraft that go out over the ocean. We can see them, we can track them, we know exactly where they are. And on a day-to-day basis, I'm pleased to say what that means is if there are occasions when pilots aren't quite doing what they're supposed to do, we know about that straight away. Getting back to the point that I made earlier in the call, we used to rely on position reports being passed by voice. And so if an error was made, we didn't know if the pilot was going to the incorrect position or if they just stated that they were going to the incorrect position. Or worse, perhaps the radio operator had misheard the position or had typed the incorrect position down to us. So in all of those cases, we as controllers had to react and query that position, find out if there was any traffic there, and potentially issue traffic information to the other aircraft if we thought there was something there. Now we can clearly see, is an aircraft going where they're supposed to or not?
And I guess you can take corrective action straight away now without having to wait for the position report.
Absolutely. We can see when an aircraft deviates. And I think that's a really key point, is the fact that a lot of how procedural control worked on the ocean was, as controllers, we were reacting to situations. So pilots would employ aviate, navigate, communicate, as we're taught at the college very early on. And clearly the last part of that is tell ATC. So there would be cases where we would be told that an aircraft had an emergency, was now down at 10,000 feet and was now heading to Reykjavik, at which point we would go, okay, that's brilliant, thanks for that. Yeah. And we very much felt like we were picking up the pieces of whatever happened, and we weren't really helping and supporting anybody in that. Now, in the event that an aircraft has a situation and needs to take action, we may not have had the communication yet to say what's going on, but we can clearly see that there is a situation and we can react accordingly.
Yeah.
We can be ready to respond and give help to that aircraft. Most importantly, we can let other aircraft around about know what's going on and give them any reclearances that they might need.
Incredible. So, I mean, Vinny, you guys have delivered worldwide global surveillance for the first time in aviation history. What do you do next?
Well, there's plenty to do, but may I just add to the Advanced Surveillance Enhanced Procedural Separation, ASEP's comment, because I think this isn't a boutique deployment, right? It's NATS and NAV Canada basically paved the way, ran the trials that established the ICAO's standards. And so now globally, getting into the global question you were just raising, and what's next is the rest of the world can now use those standards. And it's always the hard, the first person out has the harder job to kind of prove the standards, because there's a lot of math and science that goes into it up front. But eventually you got to put it into operational practice and see it over time to validate it does what you thought the math and science said it would do. And you find things. And I think Rob has understated maybe a little bit of what they've done, because they've established a global standard. They drove that with the trials on the North Atlantic tracks, and I just want to emphasize that, because I think that's a big step forward. And now the rest of the world gets to enjoy the opportunity to use those standards in their oceanic airspace. So you said, what's next? Well, we're looking and deploying worldwide. We have multiple ANSPs under contract. There's over 18 right now, and we're moving forward with expanding this into the traffic flow management function. So for Rob to do what he said was the 14 nautical miles separation, we're providing an 8-second update interval. So earlier you mentioned ADSC, which has this contract capability, and buried in that is the update interval. How fast do you get information? And it could vary. It could be 14 minutes, but let's just say it's 10 minutes at best, right? And when you lower the update, when you make the update interval more precise and have a more currency to it, you're able to separate the two planes closer. And that gives you that flexibility that Rob was talking about. And I think, what we're looking at is when you consider that now a large part of the world is basically unsurveilled, you can now look at the traffic flow management component of this, which really blends the idea of knowing where the aircraft is at all time, from the time it pushes back, time it's over the ocean, to the time it parks in its position at the airport. And we can track the aircraft on the surface. We see them in the ocean, obviously, and it's having that big picture and its contiguous surveillance that I think improves reduces the variance and improves the predictability of where the aircraft is and where it plans on going. And once you couple this up with flight plan information, so the destination airport, you really can change the way you queue planes strategically, hundreds of miles out. And all that kind of translates into those benefits that where do you take delay? You could take it while they're flying. You could, so you can not take it on the ground where it's kind of, I think, inefficient fuel burn, right? So you want to kind of shift the delays or spread it across the system. And I think this opens up the opportunity for air traffic controllers to look at this from a very strategic perspective. And just one other component with Rob was mentioning the reactive nature of how they operated. And I think now they're in a proactive posture where they understand someone deviating before the deviation gets too crazy. And so they're actually preventing things from occurring. And maybe you won't be able to count all that because they're seeing it and communicating to the pilot and getting them right back on track. And they know, the cleared flight level to the selected flight level, which is a big deal. Right? They're preventing the situation from deviating too long, which is what I think in the past that was the situation. So again, predictability is big. Aireon's interested in continuing to provide services to the ANSPs, but also to other operators, whether it's the airlines. Everyone stands an opportunity, right? Even insurance companies, noise abatement. There's so many different elements, safety organizations, that you can just kind of continue to look at this data. And obviously one of the biggest things, and our friends in Ireland, the Irish Aviation Authority, have run this component called Aireon Alert, and they use this for search and rescue. And essentially, hundreds of organizations have signed up for this, and they communicate with IAA to acquire the last known location of an aircraft in 15 minutes before. And they are stationed there 24/7, ready to provide this service to anyone that has signed up. And you have to be pre-registered to do this. And you have to be in the ANSP or the rescue coordination centers, but it's global and it's used a lot, and it's pretty amazing. There's been some noted saves and response time to get to the downed aircraft, so it's very exciting. So there's so many dimensions to this. Everyone can spitball a whole bunch of great ideas.
Absolutely. And Rob, now that we're up and running, what other benefits have you got up your sleeve that we can use this for?
To be fair, we're already utilising it for more than just the ASEPs. I think that the safety things happen by default, without a doubt. And a lot of these we anticipated, and some of them we didn't anticipate when we got them. And it was brilliant for us to be able to see how aircraft behave if they do have contingencies, what they do, and have that assurance that they're following the procedures as published. But what we were also able to do at the same time was enable things such as giving flights variable MAC. It's known by a number of terms, but essentially, if I take you back to what I first said, we would give an aircraft a cleared flight level, a cleared MAC number, a cleared route across the ocean, and that's planned in safe. So what we can now do is we can vary that.
Right.
Aircraft don't want to be flying a fixed MAC. They don't do it anywhere else. They want to be able to fly econ. And so by using the ADSB information, we're able to say we are getting frequent enough updates that, yeah, actually, if there's nobody around about you, go ahead. You can fly at normal speed. And there's guidance out there in terms of what normal speed equates to, but essentially they can vary by plus or minus 0.02 of a Mach. without having to notify ATC, which is fantastic because it allows them to respond to weather events and to just do it. And it allows them also to take advantage of fuel savings, or if schedule is more important for them, then obviously they can increase speed and take advantage that way. So that's something that we introduced with ADSB, and since the introduction of ADSB, we've been trying to open up that opportunity to as many aircraft as we can flying across the ocean. Besides that, we also have plans. We're looking at this data and we're thinking, how can we use this better? And something that we didn't have previously was we didn't have any information essentially before the aircraft came to us. We have our boundary with our domestic agencies, and we would receive the estimate for the ocean entry point, but we couldn't see it. And now we have a 200-mile buffer essentially around our airspace. So whilst aircraft are in domestic and coming to us, we can see them. And that's a brilliant thing because it allows us to, again, take the guesswork out of things. If we had an aircraft enter our airspace perhaps later than it was planned to, it can look on our system like that's going to be an issue with another aircraft, and perhaps we need to re-clear that second aircraft. We used to have to call the domestic controller and say, can you give me an updated estimate on radar? And initially, I think a lot of my colleagues were still doing this because they didn't realise that the plot that they could see on their display now, well, that's where the aircraft is. So actually, you don't need to bother your radar colleague. You can use the tools at your disposal on your system, and you can find out for yourself, do you know what? This one also is going to come in a minute later. I don't have a problem here. So there's subtle things like that that help us every day, day in, day out, to provide a better service. But besides that, we certainly would like to look to developing tools to say, actually, how else can we use this ADSB data and the other data that we've got coming in to make better strategic and tactical decisions? And anything that we can do to enable us to give more of our customers what they're after is a good thing. And with the huge amount of data that ADSB provides, we have that capacity. And without it, we're simply blind, essentially.
Yeah. It's brilliant to hear that as well. You mentioned the environmental benefits of giving the crews the ability to manage their aircraft more environmentally friendly. Is a great bonus for us as well. Guys, we could literally sit here and natter all day, but I'm conscious of the fact that we've got a whole load of questions flying in. It's been a brilliant discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I've certainly learned a huge amount of a side of ATC that, quite frankly, embarrassingly, I knew very, very little about. But let's go over to our audience for some questions. So our first question is from Michael at the FAA, and you guys can just jump in here. What's the typical time delay between a new instruction and the acknowledgement from the aircrew whilst flying over the ocean?
That can vary. I would say, the brilliant thing about a domestic controller is that they've got radar, that they've got instantaneous VHF comms. Now, what ADSB gives us is it plugs the gap in respect of surveillance information. So we can see, but where we still fall down a little bit on the ocean, because we can't have VHF radio, because it's such a vast expanse, we still rely on HF, and we still rely on CPDLC, I mentioned previously. And so if something's going out over HF, it can take a little bit longer for us to get a response. We can get quite a good response time.
I think we might have had a little problem with Rob there, so I'm going to jump straight over to Vinny. Vinny, we've got a question from Martin, which is, how is the redundancy of the satellites managed? I'm guessing they've got a finite life. And how do you intend to maintain permanent coverage?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And all systems usually are designed around a life cycle, so you have a targeted end of life design, goal. And the Iridium slash hosted payload of Aireon's ADSB payload is designed for like a 20-year life cycle. They've proven that already with the old version of the system that was deployed at the end of the 90s, and I just said was kind of completed in 2019. They started to pull out the old ones, so we've got 20-year life cycle. I mentioned earlier 9 spares are in space, so we have 75 satellites in space. 66 are being used operationally. There's 6 polar orbit, and right. So, and we have spares in each one of those polar rings, right? So that way we're able to move a satellite in if we have to, and pull out the old one. So we're prepared to do that. And then there's 6 spares on the ground, ready for deployment over the life cycle. So we'll be refreshing the infrastructure over that timeline. It's a pretty interesting system. They actually can communicate with it, control it. We can change the software of our payload. We can upgrade it for the different, standards changes as that goes on. And ADSB kind of adds more interesting information packed into the message. So we have to change our receivers, and we can do that remotely from the ground, and we've demonstrated that already multiple times. And then, so the talk about the redundancy, the satellites are overlapping quite a bit, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. You have 6 or 7 satellites looking at one plane. So, when you get down the equator, it starts to stretch out a little, obviously. But there's still, like, if there's one, there's one satellite with all the edges of a Venn diagram, but having like 4 other satellites kind of cutting into it. So there's a lot of overlapping capability that provides the resiliency. And then obviously we have 24/7 network operations centers that are operating both as the tier 1 to the customer. That's what Aireon does. And then we manage our both Harris and Iridium as they manage subsystems of the service. And all that translates to automation and response time, detect and respond for any incident that occurs that manages to keep the service running. And all that is through communications with the ADSB, because you all know how to deal with the problems as if we have a planned maintenance, that's one thing, and then there's the unplanned ones that always kind of, if you can predict and help and keep the controllers in the loop, they know how to deal with the situation, right? They go back to using procedural separation so they could manage their airspace. And we've had those events. I think Rob could attest to that.
We've had a couple, and I'm pleased to report that, in relation to other parts of the system overall, actually the ADSB has been really solid for us overall. And I think that the key thing, obviously I dropped out there, brilliant home working. The key thing there for me is difference between ADSB information and, say, primary radar information is we only need 1 satellite there to be picking up the information from the aircraft for it to come through to us and for it to be good. We're very lucky that over the NAT, as I'm sure Vinny mentioned, essentially we could have 3 satellites over picking up the same signal from the aircraft at the same time. All of that essentially is redundancy for us.
Wow. Amazing stuff. Rob, we've got a question from Simon at Heathrow Airport. It's one of my favorite airports. Does the technology give you the ability to predict conflicts and propose resolutions, kind of like, I guess, on a standard radar screen with your kind of future track lines and things like that on it?
The way that the oceans always worked is in terms of feeding those key details in that the aircraft's clearance has and having the flight data processor essentially make those calculations for us from ocean entry all the way to landfall. So we've always had that capacity. What ADSB allows us to do is know that because we're going to get more frequent updates and more reliable information, we can put aircraft much closer together and have assurance that when we think something's going to work, it's going to work. And in the event that it's not working out because the weather's different to what we were expecting, we're going to get notification of that a lot sooner and we can react a lot quicker. And the other brilliant thing about it is there's a lot more get out of jail free cards for us as controllers. Because ADSB opens up those opportunities, if something's going wrong, I have more ways to get out of it.
Excellent.
I'd like to, Eddie, if I could add something. So the idea of what's the integrity of the data is an important component that helps the automation do those predictions and help with the conflict probing. And Aireon is surveillance as a service. Right, no one's buying the satellite. We're selling the data, and the data is basically certificated under EASA, or the European Aviation Safety Agency, which is a big deal, right? We went through a very onerous, journey with EASA to get our certificate, and we're actually coming up on our first, re-up of it. So we've had a 2-year certificate. It ends in December, and then we got to go through the process, and we're on the continuous audit, continuous oversight, and it just manages us as a company, but we manage our configuration, our quality, all those things, security, safety, all these are the things, the dimensions that the ANSPs live by. Aireon has to live by, and we're just an extension of your tech ops department, right? Yeah. And we have to act like that and be ready and be in your shoes. And so we're providing data that's feeding those automation platforms. It's all about the assurance level of the software and the integrity and the continuity of the service. And so I think all that helps with these ideas of doing predictions and reduced separation. It's all an important ingredient to delivering the service.
Excellent. Well, talking of Europe, we've got a question from our colleague Francesca at Airbus, who asks, how will NATS coordinate operations with ANSPs that have not deployed ADSB? So how does that work, guys?
Seamlessly, absolutely. We're quite lucky on this. I want to take it back to a point that Vinny made earlier, which was that essentially when these guys brought ADSB in for us to use, NATS and NAV Canada were leading the way in using this data and proving the point in relation to ASEPs. And as Vinny mentioned, it's only within the last week or so that ASEPs has been approved across the globe for use. And that was a lot of our hard work that's allowed that, but that opens the door for a lot more ANSPs to use those separation standards. Ultimately, since day one of us using it, we've had to cope with ourselves and our counterparts in Canada, GANDA, being able to use the separation standards, and other ANSPs around about us who don't. So we both have some very clever processing under the hood in the system that allows us to fully utilize ASEPs within the airspace where ADSB is enabled. And in those pieces of airspace where it's not enabled, we'll have another form of separation provided at the boundary. In the event that anybody else is able to come on board and join us in this wonderful party, all we have to do essentially is flip a switch under the hood and we can start applying ASEPs all the way into their airspace.
Wow, fantastic. We've probably got... go on, Vinny.
Yeah, just to add real quick, I mean, there have been over 10 to probably 15 air navigation service providers that have put a rule in, a mandate, that enforces that the aircraft performs, the avionics perform a certain way. That's increased the amount of ADSB aircraft globally, which is probably like a big piece of our business case, right? Why would we deploy in space if people weren't equipped? So there's a large amount. And then I think, you were just hearing Rob talk about, there's many ways of dealing with aircraft that aren't equipped. You deal with poor transponders now. You segregate the airspace. You put the ones with, it's like the easy pass lane, right? For us, it's like, you think of it as if you're equipped, you get to go in the easy pass lane. If not, you still can use the highway. You just use the different lanes.
Right. So we've got time just for one last question. This is from Philip. Could it replace traditional ground-based ADSB surveillance systems offering global coverage of surface traffic? If so, when would this become available? So you're on the spot there, Vinny, to give us this solution.
Yeah, and let me talk from the perspective of all our ANSPs, right? I mentioned we have multiple contracts in place, and just in some cases they are looking to replace radars, not necessarily for surface, which is what this question starts to dig into, but it's always about investment and the life cycle of the piece of gear you have, and do you continue to service life extend it? Do you replace it with another radar, and or do you use this as an overlay? And so a lot of our ANSP customers are blending our surveillance source with their other infrastructure with a plan to probably lessen the amount of the quantity of their infrastructure, right? Because this kind of provides you this big overlay. As for the surface component of it, that's a great question. And my career started on surface surveillance, so spent a lot of times there. Typically you expect a 1-second update rate to provide that service in the tower, even though it's still for situational awareness, and that's just because of the dynamics of aircraft on the surface, right? You have people accelerating, decelerating, you got them going off on, into the high-speed taxiways. So there's a lot of activity going on a surface, and a lot of different dynamics. It's kind of messy, and so you need a high update interval. And I mentioned earlier that we can do an 8-second update interval, 96% probability though. So we have seen, like in the northern hemispheres, that we can get reasonable update intervals, but not down to 1 second. So it just depends on your application. If you're using it for situational awareness, you want to track into the ramp area, you want to watch them go out into the taxiway. We see them now with accuracy that's pretty astounding. I mean, and that's coming from the GPS or the GNSS. But I mean, they're right down the runway. They're right down the middle of the taxiway. So the accuracy is phenomenal. It really comes back to the update interval. And so I don't see us replacing surface surveillance, but I see us augmenting.
Well, gentlemen, on that bombshell, my thanks to Rob and Vinny, a really interesting insight into the hidden world of oceanic ATC and ADSB. When I'm next in the tower clearing someone to JFK, I'll be able to know a little bit more about the magic of how we handle that flight across such a vast ocean. Thanks to everyone for watching. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. That is a wrap for the first episode of Altitude. But we believe we've got a second series and we're coming back next month. So in the meantime, if you've got any feedback or questions for us on what you'd like us to talk about, please email us at info@nats.co.uk. Keep an eye on the Nats social channels for details of episode 2 coming very soon. I hope you can join us again. Goodbye.